Thank you for coming to my talk. I'm going to try and get us done as close to lunch as I possibly can, but we did start a little bit late. Today I'm going to be talking about hidden gems in MySQL Shell, and just to give you a little bit of a preview into my mind, I would be willing to admit that not all of these are hidden, but I will not give up the fact that they're not all gems. So before we get started, a little bit about me, my obligatory I love me slide. I'm a full stack developer. I have been a full stack developer since before the term full stack developer actually existed. The only constant that's been in my development stack since then has been MySQL. I used MySQL on my first job as a web developer over 20 years ago, and I'm still using it today. And I've pretty much had some project, whether personal or professional, running on a MySQL database every day since then. Before I became a developer, I used to be a paramedic. I spent 14 years as a paramedic in New Jersey, and in that time, I delivered 3 babies, which is an awesome feeling, especially when you consider the fact that one of them has the middle name Scott because I delivered the baby in the back of a moving ambulance, which was kind of cool. When the woman told me that, I cried. It was kind of funny. And then this is my best friend in the world, Murphy. This is my Labradoodle. He spends all day, every day in the office with me. I don't care how cool you think your dog is. He's not as cool as Murphy. Okay, but this is when he was a puppy. This is the 112-pound beast he is now. What I love about having him in the office is when I have a problem and I'm trying to work through something, I don't have an office mate to talk to, so I talk to Murphy. And he looks at you with those eyes, and then suddenly the solution comes to you. This dog knows more about databases than any dog in the world. So what is MySQL Shell? Show of hands, how many people here use MySQL Shell? Oh, awesome. There's a lot more people here than I anticipated. So the people who didn't raise your hand, I hope by the time we're done, you'd be able to raise it next time, because MySQL Shell is really cool. It's I think one of the neatest products that we have related to MySQL. So it essentially is a modern CLI. It kind of takes the place of the old MySQL client. It's used for connecting to and managing MySQL instances, but it goes way beyond that, as you'll see in some of the stuff that we're going to talk about. It has different modes that you can issue your commands. It has a JavaScript mode where the commands you enter will use JavaScript syntax. There's a Python mode, hold on, where you can use Python syntax. And then there's a SQL mode, where the SQL mode is kind of what a lot of people would be used to with the old MySQL executable, where you can actually just run SQL queries against your database. And there's many, 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 many useful features. If I could do the talk of everything I wanted to talk about in MySQL Shell, this would be like a whole day workshop, because there's so many cool features. This is just like the tip of the iceberg for me. One of the features I love most about MySQL Shell is the fact that it allows you to spin up local sandbox instances with one command using the MySQL you have installed on your system. And it allows you to do a lot of different things. One of the things I use it for is I don't like to clutter up my main MySQL instance I have running. So if I want to do some tests or I'm loading in some dummy data that I don't really care if it gets deleted, I'll spin up a sandbox instance and use that for demos, or as Alex said, when I do videos, I use sandboxes a lot. Things you need to keep in mind is they only run on your local host. So whatever machine you actually run the command to spin up the sandbox, that's the only host that you're allowed to hit them to. You can't hit them remotely. And you must have MySQL already installed on the system on which you run the command. So if you remote into an instance that like a compute instance that doesn't have MySQL installed on it, you're not going to be able to execute sandboxes. And the command to do that is pretty simple. You do dba.deploy sandbox instance, and then the argument you pass in is the port number that you want the instance to run on. So here you'll see we're creating a sandbox instance using port 3336. And then once you run that command, you'll get some messages letting you know that it's going to be created, where it's going to be created. It gives you the message that it's only suitable for deploying and running on your local machine and not meant for production. And then it asks you for a password. Now you can provide the password when you call deploy sandbox instance, but it's more typing, and I don't like to type, so I always wait and put the password in here. And then I'll say deploying your new instance, localhost or instance localhost 3336 successfully deployed and started. And then it tells you to use shell.connect root at localhost, blah, blah, blah. But again, because I don't like typing, I use the shortcut. So if I want to connect to it, I use /c, root at localhost 3336. It'll prompt you for a password if you haven't already connected. When I put these slides together, I had already connected to this instance, so it remembered my password in MySQL Shell. And then you connect and you'll see that when I put these slides together, I was using 9.1, not 9.2. And now you have your default, you have this instance that you're running that runs completely isolated from your main instance. Some of the other commands you can do for managing sandboxes, you could do dba.stop sandbox instance. Again, all of these are going to take the port number that the instance is running on. Stop sandbox instance is a graceful shutdown. So this would be as if you were trying, say you're trying to shut your system down and it does it gracefully. If you have an instance that is stopped, you use start DBA or start sandbox instance. If you want to kill an instance, you do kill sandbox instance. The difference between kill and stop is kill is sudden, it's not graceful. So if you're working on, say, your MySQL architectures and you want to make sure that you have everything set up correctly so that there's automated failover when one node fails, you would use kill sandbox instance because that actually then replicates the server just crashed. And then when you're done with everything, you do delete sandbox instance. The other thing that I tend to do every once in a while, because I sometimes forget which numbers I use for which things, is I actually go into the folder where these were created and just delete the folders. And then they're gone. You can't use them again. Server upgrade check. This is actually a really nifty feature where if you're running a slightly older version of MySQL and you want to see if your database schema and everything actually is compatible with the latest version, you can use MySQL Shell to upgrade. So it basically goes through your database schema and checks to see if there are any issues with upgrading to the version that you want. Now by default, if you do DB server upgrade check, it will use the version of Shell as the version of MySQL it's going to check. So if I'm running MySQL Shell 9.2 and I run this command, it's going to make sure that the database I'm connected to can be upgraded to 9.2. But you can provide the instance that you, or the version that you want as an argument when you call the command. And it's called util server, or check for server upgrade. That's it. There is an options block you can pass in, or an optional options block, and that's where you would pass into the specific version that you want to connect to. And in this particular case, it tells you it's going through, and I ran this against the main instance I have on my laptop, and it's telling me that it's checking to see if I can go from 9.1 to 9.2, and it runs through a bunch of different things that you can do. First thing it does is it checks to make sure that if there's any deprecated, removed, or changes in default values or invalid values. Thankfully in this case, there was no problems. Next thing it does is it runs through to see if there's any issues with the data. Here you can see in this particular table, which was set up for the MySQL REST service, that one of the columns is listed as UTF-8 MB3, which has been deprecated, and I should upgrade it to UTF-8 MB4. That's the cool thing about server upgrade check, is the fact that not only will it tell you you have issues, it'll tell you how to fix them, or give you suggestions on how to fix them. Next thing it does is it checks for syntax. In this particular case, it found issues with some reserved words that were not reserved when the tables were created. And it gives me a list of exactly what is wrong. Here you'll see this is coming from the InnoDB cluster metadata. And it's basically saying that there's a syntax error in there somewhere, and then it gives you a link to say, hey, go figure out what you did wrong. And next it makes sure, next it makes sure that, did this go off? Okay. Next it makes sure that your foreign keys are actually checking full unique indexes. In this particular case, it's not. And it'll actually go through and tell you what was wrong, and again, how to fix it. This is how you're telling you how to fix it. You can create a non-unique key to a unique key, remove the foreign keys. And the other cool thing is the fact that it doesn't give you just one option sometimes. It'll give you multiple things that you can do to try and fix the problem that it found. And it checks for deprecated or invalid user authentication message. In this particular case, there was nothing found. And then it gives you a summary. So you see there were 4 errors, there were 3 warnings, and there was 1 notice. The errors you have to fix, the warnings you should fix, the notices you can probably disregard. Notice I said probably and not should disregard. This advanced data dump and advanced data load, which will be the next section after this, are probably the features of Shell I use more than anything else, because I'm constantly taking data from one instance and moving it to another just to test things out. And probably the best thing for me about the data dump is the fact that you can do multi-threaded dumps and multi-threaded loads. So if you need to move data from one instance to another, having it multi-threaded is going to make it a lot faster than MySQL dump. And you can also limit it to specific tables in a particular schema, a list of schemas, or the entire instance. When you dump an entire instance, it will not copy over the system table. So the MySQL table, the information schema table, those will not get copied over. It's just anything else that is not a system table. Excuse me. You can also set it up so you can filter the data that you're dumping. So if you're going to be dumping data from one particular table, you can actually add a query that says, only give me the rows where this column equals this value or is greater than this value. So you can filter the data that's actually getting dumped. You can dump to cloud providers. There is actually functionality in the options, and there's an example that I have where you could dump your data to an OCI bucket, an AWS bucket, a bucket in Azure, or basically anything that is S3 compatible. You can dump your data directly to that. And then you can also check to make sure that if you're thinking that you have, or if you're contemplating moving to HeatWave MySQL and you're not sure if your database can support it, you can actually add an option to that, so it'll actually check to make sure that what you're going to be dumping can be loaded into HeatWave MySQL and be supported. So the first example here is dump instance. So what I'm doing here is I'm saying I want to dump everything but the system tables, and it's going to dump it. The first argument in any of the dumps is always the path of where you want it to go. So here it's going to dump it into a folder named dumps off the root of my user into a folder named example1, and that's how you tell it how many threads to use. Now in this particular case, I just chose 8 because it was more than 4, but keep in mind that adding more threads is not going to make it always be faster. Sometimes adding more threads will make it slower. So if you have 24 threads available and you say, let's do 20, you might not get as good a performance in that as if you say 16. It's kind of, you got to kind of like play around to see where the sweet spot is. If you want to just dump schemas, you call dump schemas and you pass in an array of schema names. And yes, there is a typo here. There should be a bracket after the tick after shorts. But this is going to be a comma delimited list in an array, basically in a JSON array of the schemas that you want to dump. And again, here you see we're dumping it into the folder name example2, and I'm using 8 threads. When you call dump tables, you got to give it a little bit more information. We give it the schema name that we want, and then the array of table names inside of that schema. And they're actually, the path to this is actually missing in this example too. There should be a path in front there. And then we're dumping, oh no, I'm sorry, then we're dumping it here. So I was wrong. It's not the first one in everything, but it's in the first one in most of them. So that's going to be going to example 3. So what's happening here is it's only going to take the data in the schema in the games table from the MySQL short schema and dump that data. And here as we say, hey, we're doing the same thing, we're calling dump tables, but we only want information from the games table where the value in the score column is greater than or equal to 90. So this is actually going to filter out the data in the dump so that we're not dumping everything in the table, just whatever matches that where clause. If you have other where clauses you want to use, you just basically append them. You would append it like here, do comma, and then add another JSON object to say the column name and the condition. And then to dump to an OS bucket. So here, we're doing a dump instance. It says we're dumping it to database underscore dumps. This is actually going to dump this to a bucket that I have existing in my OCI account named database dumps. Now you're probably going to need to provide the compartment ID if you ever tried this. If you tried it like this, you're gonna get an error. The reason why it's not here is because in my OCI implementation on my laptop, I actually have compartment ID as one of the properties that's set in the config file, so that I don't have to keep entering it because it's a really long number and sometimes it's a pain to find it. And then here's how you check to make sure that you're gonna be HeatWave MySQL compliant. That's the option you put in the last block there, is OCI MDS equals true. And that'll give you a summary of what might be wrong with your database, or it could just say, hey, you're good to go. When you do your output, the output is actually a mix of SQL files, JSON files, and binary files. And this is a very short one. If you have a lot of tables in whatever you're dumping, there's gonna be a lot more files that are gonna be there. But this is basically an example of what it looks like if you looked into the folder that you created the dumps in. So we now have advanced data load. One of the cool things about the advanced data load is it's multi-threaded, just like everything else. And unlike using the dump, so when we have dump tables, we have dump schemas, we have dump instance, we just have load dump. So whether you dumped the entire instance or just one particular table from one particular schema, you're still gonna call load dump. If you want to, as long as you're not doing this as part of like an initial replication, you can actually disable the bin log before you do the load, and it'll actually help the data load faster. And again, we can load data from an OCI bucket, an Azure bucket, an AWS bucket, or anything that's S3 compatible. Also by default, when you load data, if you have a dump and a table does not have a primary key set, when you load it, it will create an invisible primary key for you automatically. So the first thing you need to do when you try to do a load dump is you need to make sure that local in file is set to on. If you don't do that, you're going to get a message that tells you, hey, you need to set it to on. And this is going to be on the target system. So whatever your system you're trying to load the data into, this is what you need to do. And then we have load dump. Here we got example 2, and we're saying to use 8 threads. So it's going to read the data that's in example 2, and then it's going to actually push that data into the instance that you're connected to, and it's going to use 8 threads to do it. This is how you skip the bin log. It's actually an option in the thing itself, so you don't have to worry about going in and turning off bin log, and then when you're done turning it back on, this will handle it for you. It'll actually turn the bin log back on when this command is done running. Again, calling from an OS bucket name, you can do here, again, we're reading from a folder named example2 that's in my database dumps bucket. If you're using OCI, you're going to have to probably include compartment ID in this if you don't already have it set up the way I do. But I like doing that because it's a simpler example. And then you can do create invisible PKs as another option. There are, just so you know, for the data dump and the data load, there are a lot of other options that you have available to you. Those are just the ones that I thought would be the most useful and probably the most used. Again, I could probably do a whole hour just on these 2 pieces of functionality. So interesting story about this particular feature is I gave this talk in Belgium in the pre-FOSDEM days, and one of the questions I got was, can you do an incremental dump? Meaning if you dump data, can you then do another dump that only gets the data that's changed since the last time you did the dump? And at the time, I thought the answer was no. But when I was investigating another question somebody asked me, I stumbled upon this, and it was new. It's new in, I believe, 9.2, because that's when I first saw it. And what dump bin logs does, it actually allows you to dump the bin logs, and it's based off of a previous dump, okay? So things you need to keep in mind. The source database has to have binary logging turned on. GTID mode must be set to on or on permissive. If it's set to off or off permissive, this will not work. You can dump this, surprisingly, to any type of cloud storage bucket, all the ones that I've mentioned before. And in order for this to work, it can only be used with a previous dump instance. That's important. You have to dump the entire instance, or based off of a previous dump bin logs. So if you think of doing a dump instance as like a full backup, and then you did a couple of dump bin logs after that, then those bin logs would be like the incremental. So you're only getting the changes either from the dump instance or from the last dump bin logs. Just to give an example, so I had 2 sandboxes set up, and in one of them I have data, and I copied the data. So I did a dump instance, and then I did a load instance on the second the second sandbox. I have a table named pets, and I insert a table in there where the values of name are Molly and type is dog. Yes, I used to have a dog named Molly. Okay, then I do util.dump bin logs. I give it the path. Again, here it's going to dump/bin log. And then the option here is since dumps/instance dump. So the instance dump I use to populate the second sandbox instance is what I'm using here. You have to have some point for it to know what are we getting the changes from, okay? So here it's saying the initial dump that I did, that's where we're starting from. And it'll go through, and you'll get a lot of information that tells you. You can scroll back and it'll show you, how many bytes were written, what was the compressed throughput. Obviously, because I only made one change, there's not going to be a huge amount of data in here. So that's how you do the dump bin logs. Okay. Now, what's the sense of dumping bin logs if you can't load the bin logs? So here again, it's in 9.2. The requirement you have is the directory used must contain a dump that has information from calling the dump bin logs command. You can't dump an instance and then try to load the bin logs from that instance. This has to be done after you've dumped the bin logs. The dump must be completed. What that means is if you have a huge process that's going on and you dump the bin logs, you need to wait till that's done before you try to load them. I know that makes sense, but I had to say it anyway. And then the dump must be compatible with the target version. So if you're trying to go between versions of, a lower version is the primary and a higher version is a secondary, you need to make sure that those are compatible. Doesn't mean you can't go between versions, but sometimes the versions aren't compatible to do the bin log dump. And then to load it, you do load bin logs, dump/bin log. And then here we have ignore GTI gap to set to true. And the reason why I needed to add this for the demo was because the second instance was loaded from a dump instance. So there was a GTID gap in the bin logs on the second instance. Even though no data changed in between, there was a difference because of the way things got processed with the load. So if you say skip the gap, then you can load the bin log data with no problem. And then again, you'll go through and it'll show you the information that you want. Obviously, if you have a lot more information, you may have more than one bin log that's being processed, and the data site's going to be better. I mean, this was like milliseconds because the data set that was so small. But then on the secondary one, if I do select star from MySQL shorts.pets, we'll see that Molly actually got added in there. Now this will actually also capture schema changes. So if we added a new table, or we added a new column or changed the data type, and then did a dump bin logs after a dump instance, it would pick those changes up as well. This one's pretty cool. I think this is another nifty feature, not so much because you can do it, but how easy it is to do. So an InnoDB replica set, for those people who don't know, and looking around here, I'm pretty sure everybody in the room should know what it is, but this is basically a way to set up a read replica. So you have a primary database, or primary database where you're going to be your primary server. That's going to be like the one that controls everything. So you can do read and write to that, and then read replicas you can only read from. Okay, and you can test this using sandboxes. So if you're starting out and you want to figure out how we're going to do our MySQL architecture, you can set up sandboxes, get the commands down the right way so you understand exactly what it is that's going to be happening, and then you could test it, and then you'll know whether or not it's going to work. And you can actually set up a read replica with one primary and one secondary using 2 commands in MySQL Shell. So the first thing we do is we create a replica set. So we say dba.create replica set demo_set. That's the name of the replica set. What I like about using MySQL Shell for stuff like this is you see I do var rs equals. That means for the rest of my commands, I can just do rs, and it keeps the pointer for the variable name. And it'll go through and give you information. So here you say that we're creating a replica set where the primary is localhost 5555. It checks the connectivity, updates the metadata, and then it says it was successfully created. And then it tells you to run rs.add instance to add asynchronously replicated instances to the replica set. Guess what we're going to do next? We're going to add an instance to the replica set. So here we just do rs.add instance root at localhost 5556. So the reason why you need to do this, and let me back up. When you run create replica set, that has to be done on the primary. You have to be connected to the primary to run that, because whatever instance you're connected to when you run that command becomes the primary. All right? So here, we're still connected to 5555, so we have to give it the name, the username, the host, and the port number that we want to add to the secondary, add as a secondary. And it's going to go through some information. It's going to tell you it's checking replication, checking connectivity, checking transaction state. And it's going to give you some more information. And then the last thing down here, it says select a recovery method. So basically what happens is if for some reason the replicas get off from each other, you need to tell it, how are we going to fix it? When there's a problem, how do we fix it? The default is clone. And that's pretty much what I choose every time I set up this demo, but that might not be the right option for your situation. And then it goes through some more information. And again, the databases I used are really small, so this didn't happen like in real time. Like you didn't see the progress bar go, but you'll actually see that if you have a large data set that you're replicating. It'll show you the process. So it'll do the file copy, the page copy, the redo copy. And then it goes through, gives you more information about the transactions. It'll tell you it was added to the replica set, and it's adding, and then it's just waiting for changes to the primary to synchronize stuff on the back end. So literally 2 commands and you have a replica set set up. You have a read replica. If you want 2 secondaries, it's 3 commands. Okay, 3 secondaries, it's 4 commands. So that add instance is just the same. You'd run that same command and pointing it to a different server. And then you can check the status of everything by doing rs.status. And in here, the 2 things you want to see is on top, it's the localhost 5555 is set to the primary, and the localhost 5556 is set as the secondary. And then now, whenever any data was written to the primary, it'll automatically get synchronized to the secondary. And if you tried to run a write query against the secondary, it's going to throw an error, because you can only read from it. Running system commands. This is another one. Actually, this is another one that I love. I should rename this my favorite features of MySQL Shell. But I tend to spend a lot of time in Shell. But I also sometimes need to run system commands to do stuff. And switching back and forth sometimes is a pain. And it's really cool in the fact that inside of Shell, you can run system commands. Okay? So if there's a command that you want, like, the examples here, I do ls, but I don't know why you would need to use that inside of Shell. But sometimes if I'm in Shell and I want to start like a node application that's running, instead of dropping out, I can just type it in here with the system command. The results, if there's any output, they're actually displayed right in Shell. And you can also run commands that you would normally need sudo in order to run. So one of the examples is if you do /system. So /system is saying, hey, we're about to run a system command. You do ls -la/projects shell scripts, and then you'll actually see the results right inside of MySQL Shell in the console. And if you want to do a sudo, the shorthand for a system command is \!! Does anybody want to take a guess which one I use? I use this all the time. I use the shortcuts all the time because I'm a very poor typist, and the fewer characters I have to type, the less likely it is I make a mistake. So here we do \!! sudo ls /, so we want to list everything that's in the root and It'll prompt you for the sudo password. You type in the password, you hit enter, and then it will actually display the information again right inside of Shell. This is a nifty feature for people who need to work in the databases and on the code side at the same time. It really helps not having to switch things around, going from one window. I know even with tabbed command line interfaces, it still can be a pain sometimes switching, and it's just really cool to be able to do this right inside of Shell. The help system. The help system in MySQL Shell is insane. It is insanely good, okay? Like, pretty much anything Shell can do and almost anything MySQL can do is available in the help system in MySQL Shell. Every internal object, every internal method, they all have information you can get from the help system in MySQL Shell. The coolest thing about the help system in MySQL Shell is when you do /help, it gives you help about the help. Okay, it gives you a bunch of information about not only what you can ask for help for, but how those commands to get the help for those objects should be formatted. So you'll see here, you can also do like regex matches. So if you're not really sure what it is you're looking for, but you know it starts with an SU, you can do /help SU asterisk or SQ question mark. It gives you the different categories that are available. So we can get categories about the admin API, shell commands, the shell API, SQL syntax, the XDev API. We can talk about other topics. So the DBA global object, the MySQL X module. I'm not going to list them all, but it tells you all the stuff that you have available to you. Then it goes through the different shell commands. So you have the connect, disconnect, edit, exit. What I like is the fact that it also shows you the shortcut, because I don't like to type. This is still the help about help that I'm showing you here. Okay, so then it goes on. It talks about you have access to the global objects and what you can do inside of there. And then it gives you examples. So if you want an example of how to get help from the admin API, it's / admin API. I hate to ding something for having good documentation or having good help. But if you do / dump schemas, you're going to get a crap ton more information than you expected. So it starts off when it'll give you the name. This is how pretty much when you go into the objects, it'll give you the name, the syntax, and any properties or arguments that you need to add to that. So this is telling us that what dump schemas does, what the syntax looks like, what the options look like, and then it does this. That's a lot of information. Okay, I can say that when you get a lot of information like this in the console, it's kind of hard to see. So I like to either copy paste that or try to pipe it out to something else, and I can then use my IDE to search the file, because trying to search the console sometimes can be a little bit difficult. But that just gives you an example of how robust and thorough the help system is. That's all the information you could ever need to know about dump schemas. And there's a lot of other features that are available. Whoops, sorry. So if you have an external SQL script, if you have a file that's .SQL, you can actually load that script and MySQL Shell will run it without a problem. You can actually copy data between instances. So instead of dumping the data to your local system and then pushing it back out, you can use one command to move it. Now, it does actually get copied to your machine and then out again, but it's not something that you have to manage anymore. You just say, take the data from instance 1, send it to instance 2, and it handles it. You can create and manage clusters and cluster sets. You can export tables in various formats, whether it's CSV, TSV, Excel files. You can do check to see how the connection to the MySQL server is running. There's actually CLI integration for scripting. So if you have a process where you need to actually implement some of the, say, the dump and the load that you can do inside of Shell, there's actually special syntax you can use where rather than spinning up Shell, it'll actually execute the command for you. I actually have a process that does that pulls information down from a server that I manage and then dumps it into my local database. And I do that through a bash script and using the syntax there. You can do diagnostic information. You can customize it to like no end, so you can customize your prompt. So if you don't like the way the prompt looks, you can customize it. And there's even some pre-canned different versions of prompt that you can try rather than trying to get really sophisticated with the customization. There are plugins that you can run. Fred actually manages a repo that has a bunch of plugins that will load automatically when Shell loads. And you can also run startup scripts. When I first started playing with Shell, I couldn't remember the command to connect to my Golf League database, so I actually created a startup script. So I just had to do, it was like c.league is what it came up to, and it would actually run through and do the connection to connect to that particular database. And a whole lot more. There's a lot more than what I just talked about in Shell. It really is pretty awesome. So one thing that's cool about working on the community team is that we work very closely with Oracle University, and every once in a while we get to offer some free training and some free certifications. So this QR code will bring you to a page on Oracle University that will give you information on how you can redeem that. We have a special promotion going on right now. There are, I think it's 5 different trainings, four or five different trainings that you have available to you for free, and that's free. So, and it's for a limited time. I think it ends July 31st. And then so you can take whatever training you want and you get 1 certification attempt included in that for free. So if you want to go through some of the training for I know there's the DBA, there's a developer, there's a heatwave training, and then you could take the training and then use the promotion to take an exam for free, because everybody loves free stuff. If anybody has any questions about anything that you saw or I talked about today, my email is scott.strohs@oracle.com. I'm also on Blue Sky at strohs.dev, Mastodon at fstrohs, and LinkedIn at scott-strohs. And the next question is just asking next slide is asking if anybody has any questions, so I'm going to leave this up there. And does anybody have any questions?